Now, one of my favourite bits about motorsport history is the whole safety aspect thing. How back in the day they used to go out in polo shirts and polo helmets and do things like the Targa Florio and race at the infamous Nürburgring. Without seatbelts as well in some cases. But then in the mid to late 1960s, a cacophony of errors at a very wet Belgian Grand Prix led the absolute legend that is Jackie Stewart to make sweeping changes to race circuits, primarily within Formula 1. Proper crash barriers, proper helmets, seatbelts, fireproof overalls, fire extinguishers, properly trained marshals, and so on. Now at the time, some drivers didn't take him seriously. The track owners hated him because he was costing them money, and it was not until the early 1970s that it did start getting taken seriously. In 1968, the drivers got their wake-up call when Jim Clark was killed in a Formula 2 race at Hockenheim. They certainly had this whole, well, hang on a minute, if Jimmy can be killed in a racing car, then I can be killed in a racing car. It will happen to somebody else, but they were somebody else's somebody else. Today, it means that smashes such as Martin Brundle at Melbourne in 1996, Robert Kubica at Montreal in 2007, and even Romain Grosjean at Bahrain a few years ago are all completely survivable. Drivers will be shaken, sore, bruised, and maybe have a couple of hairline fractures on their hands and feet, but they're survivable. In the modern motorsport world, something has to go catastrophically wrong for a driver to be killed. Antoine Hubert and Jules Bianchi are the most recent examples, but in 2003 there was an accident that, well, it wasn't survivable, but somehow the driver survived. The location for this story is the Texas Motor Speedway, a racing venue that, if you know your American open wheel history, has got a very nasty black mark next to it. CART had done some testing at the track in the late part of 2000 and found that the speeds were well within the agreed parameters of how fast they should be going. But then when they actually got there for the race weekend, the speed started increasing. 220 became 225. That's not too bad, but then the speeds hit 227, 230, and then Tony Kanaan went out and did 236. In addition to this, several drivers had been reporting to CART's doctor, Dr. Stephen Olvey, that they were feeling a bit iffy when they got out of the car after doing some runs. They couldn't walk in a straight line for about 10 minutes or so, and they were finding their reaction speeds were in excess of about a second. Now at 230 miles an hour, that's asking for carnage when racing in a pack. Maurizio Gugelmin had already crashed heavily, and Scott Dixon recalls visiting him in hospital where he was black and blue from bruising head to toe. In response, CART tried to slow the cars down. They turned down the manifold pressures, but the engines couldn't take it. They put a Hansford device on the rear of the car and reduced the downforce, but the cars were now unstable. They were then offered the road course, but because they brought the oval spec cars, they couldn't use it. So TMS sued them for breach of contract, and also because CART had signed these cars off as safe, only for them to go about 10 miles an hour or so faster come the actual race weekend. A specialist at the University of Texas contacted by Dr. Olvey said that the drivers would start potentially blacking out at around lap 17 or so, which equated to about 4.5–5 minutes of driving. The drivers were already experiencing quite severe problems around lap 10. But this was a CART problem. Meanwhile, the Indycar series was going from strength to strength. By the time 2003 rolled around, Indy had Toyota and Honda supplying engines, and Penske and the like had switched too, taking money, drivers and fans with them. CART, on the other hand, was on its last legs, but while Indy was on the up, it almost had a fatal crash of its own. With 13 to go, that's when the accident occurred. Kenny Brack was racing Thomas Scheckter, the son of Jody, for third when the two accidentally made contact. Because of the cars being open wheel, Brack's car was launched up into the fence, rode into it briefly before landing back on the track and spinning round and round like it was a fucking Beyblade. Like Dan Weldon would a few years later, Brack actually hit the post holding the fence up, and it's that caused the sudden deceleration. But unlike Weldon, Brack was fortunate enough to hit that stanchion with the underside of his car rather than with his head. At least I think it was the underside of the car. It's very, very hard to tell. I'll leave a link to the crash in the description. You can watch it for yourself. The deceleration, which was measured by Brack's earplugs, came out at 214 G, which is the most that any human being has ever taken and survived. Brack might as well have been in a plane crash. And not a Cessna 172 plane crash either. A Eurofighter plane crash. Now it also has to be said here that Brack only sustained those G-forces for a fraction of a second, because, as you've probably seen, the fighter pilots, even with those G-suits, can only take 9G for 2 or 3, maybe 4 seconds before they start blacking out. And I've done 2 and a bit G in that radical thing I did at Silverstone in November, and that broke me. Well, I mean, it's not that hard to do, I mean. For comparison, the attempted murder at Silverstone is a very well publicised by one particular person, 51G. Grosjean in Bahrain was 67G. Ralf Schumacher at the 2004 US Grand Prix was 78G. And the previous record, if you want to call it that, was David Purley in 1977, who survived a 179G deceleration when he went from 108 miles an hour to 0 in the space of about 4 feet. Jules Bianchi's fatal accident registered at 254G. We won't talk about the car, there's nothing to talk about. The car was vaporised and it just left the tub. But Brack didn't get away with it. He broke his sternum, shattered a vertebra in his back, crushed his ankles, and broke his femur. But he was still conscious and talking while being airlifted to a nearby hospital. So assuming Brack was about 165 pounds or 75 kilos at the time, for that split second he would have weighed 16 metric tons, which is close to 35,500 pounds in old money. The crash was such a big one that it was reported on the ITV Evening News over here in England. And this is the land of football, rugby, cricket and Formula 1. To have an American open wheel crash shown on the national news over here, well, it was a big deal, because at the time we didn't really get Indycar or kart shown over here. But it wasn't the end for Brack's career. He recovered, got back into the car and was at the Indy 500 the following May. He'd retired from racing at the end of 2005 and now works as a test driver for McLaren developing their road cars. As part of that work, he briefly had the production car lap record at the Nordschleife in the McLaren P1. And he is also, as searching Alamy for pictures will attest, a decent guitar player as well, having a band simply called Brack. I might have to listen when I'm done with this. But either way, Kenny Brack is the G-Man, not that guy from Half-Life. To put it into context, the gravity in the centre of the Sun is 38G. On Jupiter it's 2.5G, because gas giant or something, I don't know, I'm not Neil deGrasse Tyson, but it's a crash that will be on highlight reels forever. And having watched so many crashes and things like that for these videos over the years, this is the one that really does make you go, how the f*** did you survive? So then, a look at Kenny Brack's miracle of a survival following his shunt at the 2003 race at Texas in Indycar. If you've learned something new here today, then do give the video a like so this video can be fired around the world, and obviously subscribe with the Stefan bell on if you're not already, so you never miss out on anything I do around here. Massive thanks as ever to the kind folk at Patreon for the support, and if you want to help out, then there's links to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord and my socials. Well, there's super thanks down there too, if you just want to do a one-off tip. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. Goodbye.